Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to join us. This is a really great evening. Our old friend Boyd Morrison, whom we haven't seen for too long, is back in a different role, and with him is his sister Beth. I am going to read this wonderful piece that the Scottsdale Republic put together in its calendar, which really impressed me with the depth with which they researched this event. Publishers Weekly calls the Lawless Land an exceptional series launch. Boyd Morrison is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of 12 thrillers, including 6 collaborations with Clive Cussler in the Oregon Adventure series. His first novel, The Ark, was an Indie Next notable pick and has been translated into more than a dozen languages. How about that?
Yeah,
I didn't even know that.
Oh, you didn't know that?
I was really impressed, right? He has a PhD in industrial engineering from Virginia Tech and lives in Seattle. In 2003, he fulfilled a lifelong dream and became a Jeopardy champion. I mean, talk about thorough. Okay, so Beth Morrison, whom you have not met because is this your first fiction?
My first fiction novel, super exciting.
It is exciting. I know I'll read what you have done here. Beth Morrison is the senior curator of manuscripts at the J. Paul Getty Museum. A leader in her field, she has curated several major exhibitions, including Imagining the Past in France, 1250 to 1500, and Book of Beasts, the bestiary in the medieval world. She has a PhD in the history of art from Cornell University. She lives in Los Angeles. That's it. But I mean, seriously, you know, if you remember the old Arizona Republic book calendar, you were lucky to get the author's name and the title and the actual date of the event. So somebody is really having a good time. You may have this.
Thank you.
I wanted to read it. So now you know who Beth is. And I will say that Boyd and I, over the course of several years, when he was writing with Clive, and we spent a lot of time together, would talk about how interested he was in working with Beth to write something, and that it would be medieval because of Beth's excellence in this field. You know anything about medieval? Is this all Beth that's doing?
Just osmosis through going
Many years,
to
decades.
exhibits and things, but I would never have done this book without Beth because I would have had to start from scratch. So it definitely made it possible to do this book because Beth was doing it with me.
And I said, would you have written fiction without Boyd?
No. And I wouldn't technically say I write fiction either, even now. We can talk a little bit about our process.
I think I could probably hear it. So back in the past, Boyd kind of gave me the manuscript, and I've read it. I have to say it was so long ago that my memory of it is less than perfect. And it may well be that it's had more editing, but we debated some interesting questions as a result of the manuscript. I don't know if my advice was helpful or not.
It was very helpful.
Very helpful.
But anyway, so I feel like I collaborated in this book, and I wish I had, at the moment, better recall than I do. What I particularly remembered that I loved, because I've been there twice, and it's such an interesting place, is there were scenes at Mont Saint-Michel. And not as it is today, which is basically, you know, a tourist trap. And now you can safely cross the sands. You're not necessarily going to drown if the tide comes in. But back when you were doing it, Mont Saint-Michel was a truly isolated place, very hazardous if you didn't know your tide tables. And I've never quite understood how they built the church at the very top in an age before cranes and all the rest of it, because it really is an astonishing structure and must have been, I mean, I think it would be even tougher than the pyramids to have built it. What's your thought?
Well, trying to get all the stone up there.
Yeah, because the stone was not local.
No, they had to float it in.
Yeah.
But I don't understand how they managed to lift it all and dress it and then put it in place and keep going higher.
I mean, they had, you know, cranes in the Middle Ages, and there's actually illuminations even in the Getty collection of how they did it, and we feature something like that in the book. But what they had was like an enormous person-sized hamster wheel, basically, that would help you get the loads of stone and the loads of mortar up to the top. But they couldn't have, but that's just to build the thing. The thing itself is then on top of a big precipice. So if any of you have ever been to Mont Saint-Michel, there's these little tiny winding streets with like a gajillion stairs. And the idea of trying to get the stone up to the part where you could even start to use the crane. I mean, that was a massive effort.
Truly. Anyway, this is a rollicking medieval adventure. Somewhat, I sort of think there's a slight taste of Clive in this.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely so. I mean, one of the things that all the collaborators learned writing with Clive was how to move a story along.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't you talk about that for a minute and how you then applied it to working with Beth?
Yeah. So, yeah, I worked with Clive on 6 books, and even before I started working with him directly, I have been reading him since the early 80s. And so I kind of just absorbed all of his lessons just by reading his books. And I think that's one of the reasons that he picked me to write with him, because, as you know, he found me through you.
Yep.
And when he was looking for a new Oregon Files author, he, as he does, I think, did with all of his books, he came here and said, who should I read? And so Barbara recommended a couple of my books, probably along with some other authors, I don't know. And he read them and loved them. And I think that was because I had taken in the lessons of pacing and action and cliffhangers that he was such a master at. And but when I got to work with him in person, I got that direct feedback when I was writing the books, and he would chop, almost always, he would never add things. He would just delete things or alter things to make it even faster pace, because he was relentless about keeping the story moving. And so when we started writing this book, I wanted to keep that same kind of pacing with this story. I've read other historical fiction, and what we wanted to get back to was an adventure tale, a high adventure in the tradition of the Three Musketeers and Robin Hood. And so we hadn't really seen that lately. They're either usually epic tales like Ken Follett, or they're more contained mysteries like the Brother Cadfael mysteries. And so we're kind of in between those.
And actually, Alexander Dumas, Père et Fils, father and son, that's a really good example. I don't know why I didn't think of that. You're right.
It's not a comp that publishers usually want to hear, because it's not on the bestseller list right now. But maybe we'll bring it back. Yeah.
Yeah, but you know what? I mean, there's the Three Musketeers, D'Artagnan, the whole bit. That people still. Those are iconic figures.
Exactly.
People still know them.
So we hope Gerard Fox and Lady Isabel are in that same tradition. So, Beth kind of got the same kind of call I got when Clive called me to work together. I was still working with Clive when I was considering what to do next, and I was thinking about doing a historical thriller. And I didn't know what time period to do. I knew a lot about. I activated Siri.
She wants to hear more.
She wants to hear. Can you Google how to write a thriller? And so I was thinking about what time period, and I knew about World War II, and I'm a big World War II buff, but there were a lot of books in that period.
Way
so
too many.
Exactly. So I wasn't going to do another one of those, and so I told my wife what I was thinking about, and she said, "Well, if you want to do a historical thriller, you've got a built-in co-author." And I said, "Who's that?" And she goes, "Your sister Beth, who is a world expert on the medieval time period." And so I said, "That's a fantastic idea." And so I called up Beth, and what'd you say?
Yes. It took me about 2 nanoseconds to agree, because I'd worked with Boyd, on his other novels, not in any really collaborative way, but like I was always one of his first readers, and I enjoy thinking about plot, and I enjoy thinking about how things fit together. And I just enjoy the thriller genre. And so when he approached me, I was all on board. And when we thought further, the Middle Ages goes from 500 to 1500. So there's 1,000 years to choose from. But I was actually working, and still am working, because nonfiction takes a lot longer than fiction. I'm working on a book about 14th century manuscript illumination. So I knew that I'd have a lot of visual comps ready to go. Do we need to know what a door looks like or a dress or whatever? I knew that I'd have all that material at hand. And also the 14th century, we decided, and this was back in 2018, we decided, well, it's a great time because there's so much happening in the 14th century. It was a great time of change, mostly because of the Black Death, which descended on Europe in the middle of the 14th century and really changed the whole social fabric of culture in Western Europe. And then there was the 100 Years' War happening at the same time. And so we just thought this would be a great time because there could be so much happening, especially since we had the intent from the beginning to make it a series.
Are you focused particularly on any one country? I know, it's hard to escape France in the 14th century, or what we think of France wasn't France. It was different provinces or countries or whatever. But today, conceptually, we're talking France.
Yeah, that was my time. That is my particular area. That's what my dissertation was in. My first exhibition, which you very kindly mentioned, Imagining the Past in France, that was it. And one of the things that was great for Boyd and I in terms of this thriller genre as well is that really the idea of a thriller originated in the Middle Ages. That was one of the great contributions of the Middle Ages to literature. The word in French for novel, which is just a generic word, is roman, which comes from the idea that it was a novel was written in the vernacular language, not the church language like Latin. So anything written in Old French, which I've studied, was called a roman. And so these stories of daring do and knights errants and princesses, that's my area of actual academic specialization. I studied the illuminations of those books. And so it seemed like a real opportunity to go back to the origins of that genre and incorporate it into a modern novel.
And that's a trope we see over and over in fiction, the knight errant from the Middle Ages. Lee Child often talks about how Jack Reacher is built on the idea of a knight errant traveling around in the medieval time period. And, the man with no name in the spaghetti westerns with Clint Eastwood, he was basically a knight errant in the Western genre. The Mandalorian in the sci-fi genre is a knight errant.
Actually, James Lee Burke and I once had a deep discussion, prompted by Patrick, about le mort d'Arthur. The whole Thomas Mallory and the whole Arthurian cycle, but we could also talk about the Chanson de Roland,
right?
Which is an epic heroic story when the Moors were were conquering or moving up different. Who stopped them from moving from Spain into French territory? And it was Roland. And they're Roman heroes, Horatio at the bridge and all that. I mean, there are some really astonishing battle, heroic warrior figures in song and legend and actual fact, I guess.
Yeah, and one of the inspirations for the main character, Gerard Fox, in our book was a manuscript that's in the Getty collection that I had written a nonfiction book about called The Roman de Julien de Trazegnies. And he is a knight, and he goes off to the Holy Land, and he ends up becoming a bigamist by mistake, and he has twin sons that he doesn't know about, and it's all kinds of adventure.
It inspired the days of our lives.
It inspired the days of our lives and our novel, but I don't think Boyd remembers that when we were looking around for the name of our main character, it basically was inspired by two things that I've actually worked on. One, you mentioned that I just in 2019, when we were actually working on this book, did a big exhibition on the medieval bestiary, which is a kind of encyclopedia of animals. And so that's where Fox came from, the last name, because we thought, wouldn't it be cool, we could have a fox on his coat of arms. But Gerard, we were going through medieval names, and I said, Julien has these twin sons named Gerard and Jean. And so Gerard is one of the twin sons that we gave birth to a new book, just like Julien gave birth to Gerard. So that's where he comes from.
French is fun because the word for faith is foi, and the word for fox is foi with an X. So I think that's a nice juxtaposition. French is a wonderful language. I mean, I've spoken it since I was a child. My mother actually won medals from the French government, but never actually did anything. I've often thought her life would have been different if she had gone to work as a translator or something, but she didn't. But it's a very rich language, as opposed to the totally incomprehensible to me Portuguese, for example, which I've never been able to figure out. Anyway, the point is that so much of what you're talking about really originates in Europe. England was more of a spectator at that point. England really didn't get its big chops until the Tudors came along. And then, Elizabeth, when they began to work towards being more of a world power. And thanks to their navy, in part, because they were isolated up there across the channel, which was a very wicked crossing, even though it's small. I've never figured out how so many people drowned in the English Channel, which is, you can see across the English Channel to France. So how is it that people have died?
I bet if you were in a medieval boat, you could see it very readily.
You wouldn't want to be in one of those boats for sure.
I know. I think, what's his name, going down in the white ship?
The white ship, yeah.
Some classic tales. Anyway, so where do your characters go? Because there's a lot of movement in this book territorially.
Yeah, well, we wanted to make it an epic trek for these characters. So we actually followed the path when we were doing our research of our two main characters as they go through Europe. So we went to England, France, and Italy, just like they did. And the premise is that Gerard Fox is a knight who's been dispossessed. He's lost his land. He's lost his reputation. He's on a quest to get it back. And while he's on this quest, he runs across a woman who is fleeing soldiers intent on killing her. And when he saves her, he realizes that they have a common enemy. And that enemy is after a priceless relic that is in her possession. And so they go on this journey together to safeguard this relic. And so it starts in southeastern England, and it goes on. And we went to Paris and Mont Saint-Michel, and in Paris we actually visited a place in the book that is featured, and thankfully we did.
Yeah, so I have the opportunity with my job, which is awesome, to go to Paris, 3-4 times a year. But I'm usually very concentrated on my job, so I'm at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, or I'm looking at other manuscripts, and I don't take very much time to play tourist. And so we were actually, doing this book, and Boyd said, well, we need to go to Notre Dame because we need to feature in the book the first time and what it was like in the Middle Ages to enter this amazing space with all these colorful windows and great sculptures and whatnot. So Boyd and I did that, and it was probably the first time in 2 decades that I had set foot inside Notre Dame. And it was just 2 months later that the cathedral had that terrible, terrible fire that destroyed so much of the roof and the ceiling of the cathedral. And so then I was so thankful, that we had done that, and I had been in to see it, because of course now we don't even know when we'll be able to go back into Notre Dame. So it was wonderful. We kind of had to pick Paris, as you said, because so much was happening in France. But then sort of one of the next stops on our journey was to go to Avignon, because the papacy plays a role in the book. And I had never been to Avignon. So I'm like, let's put Avignon in the book. And so we got to go do research through all of these amazing places.
Well, and people who are not steeped in the Middle Ages may not know that in the 14th century, the seat of the papacy was in Avignon, in southern France, instead of in Rome.
Didn't they actually maintain both?
They did after the time period of our book. They had a schism, and there was a pope in Rome and an anti-pope in Avignon. But that was after the time period of our book.
Paris, do I remember? Did you go to Saint-Chapelle?
Not for this. I've been there, but
that's one of my favorite places in Paris. So that's one tourist destination I do try to go to.
Well, you could always catch it next time. I mean, Paris. We're going to do an event Saturday with a woman who's written a very interesting book about Baron Haussmann and his mandate under Emperor Napoleon III in 1852, I think it was. Anyway, to rebuild Paris, because it had become this old and sewage-filled and neighborhood run down and just, narrow streets. It was a mess. Napoleon had tried to clean it up a little bit, to prevent cholera by having better water and some sewers and everything, but Paris was actually a disaster. And Haussmann, using eminent domain, wiped out whole neighborhoods, which was very traumatic for the people who had lived there forever. But he built the Paris that we now think of as Paris, and it's basically a mid-19th century creation. Anyway, she's written a very good story about somebody who worked with him. But places like, Saint-Chapelle and Notre Dame survived that, which is wonderful. Sacré-Cœur was a modern thing, right?
Yeah, Sacré-Cœur is modern, but around it's interesting you mention Notre Dame, because right around there is where the medieval university was, the University of Paris, which was so important, and a lot of that area was taken over by the book trade. And so I know those streets very well, and they do have a lot of the 14th century streets that weren't destroyed by the Haussmannization, which is what we call that process you were talking about. And so it's really interesting. If you go to Paris now, you can actually look up and you can see like the Rue des Écrivains, which is the scribes, and the Rue Scribe, and the Rue des Enlumineurs, so the illuminators, and they all lived in houses right next to each other. And I imagine them sort of handing medieval manuscripts over the back fence, like, oh, I'm done writing it out, now you can illuminate it. So that's still there. And that was one of the fun things about this book, is that a lot of the monuments that we describe are still there from the 14th century.
I've always found that so interesting, because in London, St. Paul's Cathedral was where all the booksellers were, it's where the publishers were, and the whole bit. I don't think we realize today that cathedrals were actually kind of like the mall, in part. I mean, there were places of worship, but oftentimes in the walls of the cathedrals and in the space around them and all, was big shopping. Have you ever gone down to Tucson to see that beautiful Dove of the Desert chapel? I'm trying to remember what it's called. It's to southeast of Tucson. It's beautiful. And strangely enough, it's the same thing there, that you can go down there if you've ever been there, and they have like food trucks and
well, there's a lot of foot traffic there, so you go where the people are going to go.
And it's the center of social life. In medieval Paris, that was the center of intellectual life, social life, and a lot of the spaces between what we think of as the very famous flying buttresses were actually filled in with little shops. So that was all filled in during the Middle Ages. It's now all been cleaned out, but it would have looked a little different in the 14th century.
Yep. So one thing I remember, and I don't know how you resolved it, because I'm going to have to reread the book, obviously, is we had a big discussion about whether Fox and the lady should team up for good or just team up for this book. I don't want you to say how it came out, because that'll be a spoiler. But I'll be really interested to see what decision you made.
We had lots of long discussions about that, and Lady Isabel was a fun character to write, because she, I think, saves Gerard Fox maybe even more than Gerard Fox saves her, and so they make a good team throughout the book.
And I think it was part of the fun of doing this book as a brother and sister, was that we had the male and female perspective. And Boyd has always written very strong female characters, but I really have always been like, let's have her, be an action figure and really, have an intellectual side. And I think that's one of the things that's nice about the characters that you might remember, Barbara, is that they're both, we wanted these characters to really have resonance with modern sensibilities. So both characters are a little bit ahead of their time. They have much more modern notions than a lot of people who are around them. And so a lot of the book is about them recognizing that in each other and kind of coming together as kindred spirits. And that was really fun to see that all come together.
See, there were really powerful women in the Middle Ages, but most of the time they were either widows, or, they were in religious orders, or, married women didn't have any rights, and they were, baby manufactured machines, if that's how it all worked out. So, you get in a woman like your lead here, and it can be really exciting, but there were people like them.
Yeah. Beth, even as we were doing this, Lady Isabel is unusual in this book, but she is not unheard of. There were Marie de France and Christine de Pizan, who were authors, And in the time period,
At the
very well
courts.
known. We even refer to Marie de France in the book
Yeah.
as a writer of romances. And then what was then Marjorie?
Marjorie Kemp was an English woman who actually was married. And she traveled by herself, actually, on pilgrimages all across Europe and all the way to the Holy Land. And she was interesting because she was a mystic, a spiritualist, and she wrote a lot about that. But in the course of recording her sort of mystic visions and whatnot, she wrote about her travels. And so a lot of people consider that really the first autobiography of the Middle Ages, and it was written by a woman. I think a lot of people don't know that. And she had like 7 children. So, she was doing both halves.
Sure enough. Well, remember Eleanor of Aquitaine went to the Holy Land, and wasn't she pregnant, I think?
She had a very adventurous life, the part that she wasn't locked up in a tower by her first husband.
She lived to be into her 80s. She had lots of children, one of them late in life in her 40s. She was a remarkable woman.
And she actually also patronized authors. She really was somebody who forwarded the arts in her time period.
And minstrels, that was another thing. People had to make their own entertainment, and so you got lots of ballads, lots of songs, chansons, and so forth from, minstrels who carried a lot of civilization around with them and created, they were invited to entertain, and they would have a large audience at the palace or wherever it would be. And I've always found those to be fascinating figures. I don't think, were there any of them women?
Not that we know of. The jongleurs mostly tended to be men, and I shouldn't speak out of turn because it's not my area of specialty, because some medievalist out there right now will be like, I know of a female jongleur. But by the time of the 14th century, when our book occurs, they were much more being read aloud from actual manuscripts, and that's where we have some of these female authors who wrote these romances, but we also have female illuminators that we know of. There was husband and wife teams, probably a brother and sister team somewhere in there, when they trained their children to take over these businesses. And as you said, the widows could be some of the most powerful people. And one of the reasons that we know that there were female scribes and illuminators is because when their husbands died, they took over the businesses and actually registered the businesses in their own names rather than their husbands. So there's probably many, many more women working on medieval manuscripts than we know of. It's just their husbands died after they did instead of before they did.
Okay. So, what do you want to say about the plot?
Well, we're talking so much about history. It may sound like we wrote a nonfiction book, but
I know. I'm worried, but I need to pull it back.
Yeah, but this is an adventure. I mean, I think it's as action-packed, if not more action-packed, than any of the books I wrote with Clive. The way I put it is, with the modern stories that I've written, we have car chases and gunfights, and in this book we have horse chases and sword fights. So we have jousting, we have tournaments, we have duels, we have secret tunnels, we have all kinds of battles, and so it really is a high-action adventure tale. But we wanted to make sure, and that's why I asked Beth to do it, that we got the details right, so that it feels like you're in that time period, even though almost all the characters are fictional. We did reference the kings of France and England at the time because they were very important to the story, but otherwise, and the Pope, although he didn't make an appearance.
No, he didn't.
The kings of England and France do, but we put them in the context of either things that actually happened or things that we could make up, and we don't know if they actually happened or not, which is great for a author of fiction because, all those spaces where we don't have records, we could just make up what they
fill
did.
it in.
Yeah. And we taught, Beth actually wrote an afterword at the end of the book to talk about all the stuff that we kept period specific or the things we might have fudged a little bit just to make a better story.
And one of the things when Boyd asked me to write this book with him, I said, okay, that's great, but the center of the plot has to be around a medieval manuscript. So it actually is sort of like a third main character in the story, and it was so much fun to come up with its backstory. But it actually, like the manuscript itself, has action sequences in the novel, which is super cool.
Yeah. There's a lot of action revolving around the manuscript.
Yeah.
So, and the other thing is we're both big animal lovers, and so Beth thinks. I think she wanted the iguana because she keeps talking about it.
The medieval iguana.
But we
got cut.
couldn't get it to work it into the story, and so we actually made it their horses. So the horses of Gerard Fox and Isabel feature very importantly in the story, and especially in some of the main action sequences, they're very important to resolving the plot. So,
and they definitely have their own personalities.
And they each have their own personalities and
flaws, and we gave them everything.
Yeah.
Backstories.
Exactly. Yeah, and there's a reason that Gerard Fox's horse Zephyr is very sentimental to him, that you'll find in the story.
I love that. I was thinking it was like Clive and the Cars, but
yeah, kind of.
Very, very similar. But actually, if you look back at actual medieval stories, horses do have names, and people are associated with their steed. You know, they're like a pair because together they were like a battle machine, right?
Yeah,
It took the horse and
they were a unit.
Yep. Yeah. And the guy to do that. So every good thriller has to have a really good villain. So talk to us about your villain.
We actually have 3 villains in this because we wanted to make it as hard for our protagonists as possible. and so they're going up against both the nobility and the church in the story. And the church was, everything in life revolved around the Catholic Church, which they didn't even call the Catholic Church. They just called it the church back then because that was the only church. And so the every aspect of your life, holidays, the hours of the day were related to the church, and so it controlled everybody's life. And so there in this story there is a cardinal who has designs on the papacy, and the manuscript at the center of the story he thinks will push him over the top to get that. To get to that post. And he teams up with Lady Isabel's betrothed, who thinks it will make him a king. And the object that's at the center of this book, it would be probably the most valuable object in the world, at least in the world of Western Europe, if it was authentic. And we even put in the story about how they could authenticate what they have, and it's a real legend. We don't know if it really exists, right?
Well, it's
hard
debate.
to talk about without giving away what it is. But
it would have a lot of power.
Yeah. So this earl in England thinks that will make him a king, and this cardinal in France thinks it will make him a pope, and so they bring every resource they have to bear to track Fox and Isabel down. And so it makes it very tough for them to get this to safety and get away with their lives. Yeah,
and then there's a third villain who's sort of the henchman of the cardinal. And he's more Fox's age, so you know
so he's the main the enforcer that's
the strong
after
guy.
them, and you'll find out they all have relationships to the main characters. And what we realized after we had come up with the plot and fleshed it out was that this really is a story about family, and family was really important in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about
now.
More than now, because everything, your place in life, everything to like where you were going to be buried was all based on family relationships, of who you were going to marry. You didn't have any choice about that. Your family decided based on strengthening blood ties. And if you think about the fact that you're in medieval Europe and they're all kings, and king is a familial relationship, his son becomes the next king. So in a society where everything is based on those blood relationships, this whole family sort of ties together in a way that's really interesting.
Well, and that's what even started the 100 Years' War between England and France, was the heirs didn't make it, and so there was a big disagreement about who was going to be the next king of France.
Yeah.
And and so they had a war for 100 years to fight over that.
Yeah.
And so that kind of shows you how important the family is.
But it was kind of cool to have these three different types of villains who all themselves have their own backstories, because they could work together, and they each have a different strength and a different way of being evil that contributes to the sort of chase across Europe.
Well, we call them villains, but really they don't think of themselves as villains.
No.
They think that they deserve what they're after. And for example, the Earl, Lord Tonbridge, who we call Tonbridge because of Barbara, we messed up something when we wrote the first draft. He is very much concerned with his status, his legacy, and he believes family is everything and loyalty is the most important trait. And so when his fiancée leaves him because of what he wants to do with the manuscript, he sees that as the greatest possible treachery that could ever happen to him. And so he, as a hunter who's noted for being able to hunt down anybody or any animal, goes after them relentlessly, and which is why he's such a formidable opponent for them, because he will not give up, and he cannot forgive this kind of betrayal of him.
And then adding to the excitement beyond the three villains after them is the time period. Because, the Black Death is still around. They, they run into pockets of it,
yeah.
and then they've got to, get across. They're English, and they've got to get across France that is currently at war with them. So there was just a lot going on. And one of the things that was sort of amazing about this book is that Boyd and I, started having the concepts for it and had written over half of it, I think, by the time the pandemic struck. And so all of a sudden we had a really good sense of what our characters were going through, because we were going through it in the modern world.
Yeah, and things that I learned because of the book, that, for example, that the word quarantine comes from the Black Death, in that the Italians would make ships arriving stay out at sea for 40 days before they could dock to make sure that they didn't have the plague. And the word in Italian for 40 is quaranta. So the word quarantine comes directly from the Black Plague.
And I think it was interesting when March 2020 came around, and I was thinking about, I've studied the Black Death sort of professionally, and it was amazing to me that here we are 670 years later, and we're all just huddling in our houses hoping for the best. Because even after all of our scientific advances, we were just as powerless in the face of COVID as they were in the face of the Black Death. All we could do was sit and wait for it to roll over us and hope that we didn't die. I mean, it was exactly the same.
Well, at least they didn't nail us shut. I mean, that's what they
Mm-hmm.
do, at least in London. They actually nailed people into, nailed the house,
Mm-hmm.
doors, the windows, and everything, and left them there. It's hard to remember, but I think, isn't it 2/3 of the population of Europe died?
There's varying estimates, but
yeah.
it's somewhere around 40 to 50%, depending on where you are. And of course, the peasantry were hit much harder than the nobility or the high members of the church, because those people could isolate more effectively.
They could
and
get out,
the peasants would, be
just
10
the living
people
conditions,
in a hovel. And close living conditions, and with lousy, and the rats, and of course the rats and the fleas were how the plague were transmitted.
But that is indeed how it really changed society. It broke up the feudal system.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful series by an author named Susanna Gregory, which is set at Cambridge in 13 whatever, around after the plague had sort of done its thing. And one of the things she wrote about was the fact that Oxford and Cambridge actually fought each other for students, because so many of them have died that there weren't enough students to keep either university going and to allow the stipends that the people who taught at the university. So they would actually conduct raids on each other, steal students and take them over. It was we've lost 1 million people, and that's terrible, but it's a small percentage of our whole population. But then, if you lost 50% or more, or slightly less of your entire population, then you didn't have anyone to work, you didn't have anyone to trade or to build or whatever. It was really an astonishing and then, terrible.
Well, it altered
event.
society. I mean, you think about how much COVID has altered our psyche and our way of looking at the world, and the thinking about like the people here, almost like half of us would be dead.
In a year, or in weeks or days.
Sometimes,
in a particular village,
yeah,
or town, it ran through in days or weeks. And it also caused labor shortages, which was why the feudal system ended, because suddenly workers could sell their labor to another noble for a higher wage.
Just like today's job market.
Yeah, exactly.
No,
I mean, we're seeing the exact same effects. Inflation was a problem, and they tried to tamp it down by passing laws that the king decreed that people could not work for a higher wage, and that caused a lot of peasant revolts in the second half of the 14th century. And we even have a scene referring to that in the book where somebody is in a pillory because they tried to sell their labor for a higher wage, and the nobles did not, because they saw that this was coming, that this was going to be the end of their era.
Had not yet taken
yeah, they wanted to unionize.
So I know this is going to be a spoiler, but are you planning on a second book?
Yes, we are already working on book 2. For that book, we went to Italy and Greece last fall to do our location research. Gerard Fox will be back, and
that was the spoiler. Who survives?
Yeah, Gerard Fox survives. Sorry, I'm spoiling that. It's not a one-off book.
It was the spoiler.
Yeah, so that's the spoiler. But we are working on book 2, and the great thing is, for book 2, when we went to Italy and Greece, we again visited locations that were there at the time of our book in 1351. And that are still intact medieval locations, sometimes whole cities, that look very similar today to what they would have looked like at the time of our book. And so it's just fun to go. We'll see we went to Florence and seeing the Palazzo Vecchio, which at the time of our book was called the Palazzo della Signoria, and it was pretty much. When we look at illuminated manuscripts, it looks almost identical to how it looks now.
Yeah.
When did Bernini do the doors?
That was
Is that a Renaissance thing?
Yeah, but there were doors there, a different set of doors. Well, actually, the other set of doors is still there. They just moved locations. But we have some artworks playing a role in the second book as well.
Of course,
so. You'll have to.
You can't repeat the manuscript.
Right.
So now it's going to be art. Dan Brown is still alive. I love this because I'm telling you, after the Da Vinci Code published, which was back in like 2005 or something, you have to look it up. There was a flood of religious conspiracy thrillers.
Yeah.
I mean, every third book, remember, Patrick? Every third book was a religious conspiracy thriller. And then, as often happens, the enthusiasm for, just one topic waned. And now we haven't seen too many for a while. So, I think it's fun. You're back in a time when those, you can do that. Patrick, did you have any questions from the audience?
Yeah, there was a couple. First question is, will there be an audiobook? And if so, will Scott break the...
I got an email from Scott. Scott, if you're watching, I love you. But we had talked to Scott when we were still working on this book, and he said, you have to have a British narrator for this because our main characters are British, and we agreed. And so they found a great narrator. Our publisher found Mark Elstob. And we love how he read it, and so the Lawless Land is available as an audiobook. And he did a fantastic job. And Scott is amazing, but I wouldn't want to put him through, a 13-hour narration reading with a British accent. That might be hard to get through. And French and Breton.
And Latin.
And Latin. Yeah, we have a lot of different languages in there.
I should point out this beautiful cover for the Lawless Land, and their publisher is actually headquartered in England, called Head of Zeus. And I have done several books for them, author and book events for them and all. And I always admire their artwork and their whole production value, actually, the entire book. They make really beautiful books. I mean, truly beautiful books.
Yeah,
We're
we've
so
got
happy
neat
with it.
maps in there to give people a sense of where they're traveling. We've got little graphics at the beginning of each chapter that actually Beth and I had developed just to give a little flavor of the characters.
It's a really nice reading experience, and it's nice that the manuscript is kind of at the heart of the book. To have a book that, somewhat could be, I mean, a very modern sort of manuscript.
And they found us a really good editor named Rashenda Todd, who has done a lot of historical fiction. And because of her, we actually, in the version after you read it, we added about 70 pages of flashbacks for the characters so we could flesh out their backgrounds. And we think that added a lot to the story.
The other question is, Barbara, can you repeat it just for me?
Sure.
If you could go back to the Middle Ages, what 3 things from the 21st century would you teach?
If you could go back to the Middle Ages, what 3 things from today would you take with you?
I think I would take a male disguise because I don't really want to be a woman in the Middle Ages, to tell you the truth. So that's probably something I would take with me. How about you, Boyd?
I would take a toilet. I would take penicillin.
Yeah, right.
And an iPhone wouldn't be useful because you couldn't call anybody.
Couldn't talk to anybody.
Come on.
A shower.
Yeah, right.
People did not bathe in this time period.
I would take medicine because there are so many things that kill people that are relatively trivial today until we go into where antibiotics no longer work. But I've often thought about that. What would you pack if you went?
Yeah.
I would actually, if you might want to consider taking glasses.
Yeah, my contact lenses.
If your sight was compromised, that would be a useful
pretty much
thing.
the end.
Maybe an old French dictionary if you're going to be in France.
Yeah. Google Translate.
That's a wonderful question, and I suspect that each one of us, if we thought about it, it would illustrate our own values, right?
Yeah.
Our own health, maybe, and our own. That's a really good question. You should add that to the book at the back next time.
Yeah.
A little book club discussion topic. What would you?
Yeah, that would be a great discussion topic because I'm sure it would be
that.
different. What people value would be
So
different.
any of you have questions? Oh, we're sitting too close to you?
Yeah.
No, there we go.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I don't want to do any spoilers, but there's a point where the manuscript gets damaged to save it. Was that physically?
Yeah, that was hard for that.
It was painful to read.
Yeah. It's always difficult. Unfortunately, manuscripts, even in the Getty collection, not when they arrive, but before they arrive, have often been through vicissitudes of life. And we were just talking about this the other day in another book that Boyd wrote with Clive, that is also about art that I helped him a little bit with. One of the things he does is dumps an entire cup of coffee on one of the paintings, and that was also like, I'm gonna have a heart attack. But and I think that people have had to make difficult choices over time about like what is the best for a particular object. We struggle with it at the Getty every day because light exposure is not what manuscripts were meant for, but we want to display them. So
that was the hardest decision.
I think we talked about that for a long time.
time.
Is there a way that we can get them out of it without damaging the manuscript?
Yeah.
And so I think I finally convinced her that this is the only way. And it kind of feeds in because the character also values the manuscript very much.
Yeah.
And so it was really a tough decision for her, but
I didn't see it. I have to admit, I didn't see it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's not tell it.
Yeah, we won't tell anymore.
Yeah. Twists and turns.
The truth is that restoration has, in older techniques, has often caused a lot of damage to paintings and to other things.
Oh yeah. Well,
modern techniques are,
Yeah, the Spanish painting.
Now we may all go.
Well, yeah, I don't know that a lot of
modern
people know that Scotch tape was actually invented in order to preserve the Dead Sea Scrolls. And because they taped them down, so they had this nice, and now, they've spent 20 years trying to pick the tape off of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Right,
So,
without burning 'em.
different methodologies for sure. We try to do non-invasive, reversible techniques now. That's what we use on manuscripts in the modern age.
Patrick, did you have another question?
Yeah, there was somebody asked a question. Made the comment that Clive always had great escapes that featured in his novels, and they're just wondering, are there some good escapes?
Are there? Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, Clive Cussler was a master at great escapes, and since Boyd learned some of this from Clive, the question is, are there great escapes in your book?
We have many
The whole book
great
is
escapes.
a whole series of great
basically
escapes.
the whole book is one long escape. But as we go, there are many escapes that
Different
happen
types.
along the way. And one of the things that was fun was coming up with these clever ways that both Fox and Isabel contribute to idea. They have little heists. They have deceptions that they do. There are secret tunnels.
Yeah.
There are getaways that they have to do, that they come up with a plan.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very much Cussler-esque kind of action scenes and clever machinations that they do.
And sometimes the escape plans go awry, and
Yeah,
then they have
sometimes
to
they
come
don't
up with
go
a
well.
plan B. So
Yeah.
that was fun too, to come up with
It
those.
takes a lot of engineering to do that. You really have to be, you have to physically envision it, you know? You have to, do you guys like block it out or walk through it?
Yeah. We spend a lot of time making sure everything makes sense to us, that this could actually happen.
And the timing. And
Mont Saint-Michel has a couple of escapes, just in that one location has a couple of escapes. And we thought about exactly how it would work. And for people who don't know, Mont Saint-Michel is surrounded by tidal flats that flood twice a day. And when the water recedes, the sand, a lot of it is quicksand.
Yeah.
And so when we saw that, and they actually show people getting, that you can actually go there and get the experience of getting sucked down into the sand, and they tell you how to escape. And so once we saw that, we were like, well, I definitely said, okay, we got to feature that somehow in the story. And so that plays a role.
And that was one of the fun things about going these places, is that in actually going the path that they do, we actually came up with like inspirational things. We're like, oh, we've got to include that, or we have a certain view. We're like, oh, we can incorporate that. So,
it gave us a sense of, it gave us a sense of how we could choreograph everything. And that may not have been as easy to do if we were just looking at Google Maps or reading somebody's description of it.
Clive had a way of thinking about how to do that not everybody does. And so I think that, that was great training.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Hello?
Oh, that's me. So sorry.
Oh,
All right.
Beth,
That's
get
the
5
bad
demerits
thing.
for not turning off your phone.
That's true. So sorry.
Actually, there is one question for Boyd.
Yes.
Okay.
Which is, somebody was just saying, what have the challenges been of, you have this established voice in Clive books and your own contemporary thrillers. Has it been a challenge to write? How do you get characters talking on the page without slipping into anachronistic language? It's got to be a real challenge.
Oh, yeah. We spent a lot of time on words that wouldn't have been appropriate for this time period, and just simple things like there's a tournament at one point in the book, and Gerard Fox is wearing armor, and it was a sunny day. And I just put in the story that he was baking like a potato. And Beth was like, potatoes are a New World vegetable, so he would not have known what baking a potato was like. Yeah, exactly. Yep. So that's the kind of thing. But also, we talked a lot about the language that they use in the dialogue. And the way we thought about it was, we wanted to give a sense of what it might have been like speaking at that time period. But of course, they spoke in Old French and Old English. So the way we looked at it was that we were just translating how they would have spoken into more a modern vernacular. But we also just wanted to give a flavor of it, so they weren't saying, "Hey guys,
Dude,
what's up?" That kind of thing that we didn't, of course, put in. But we didn't also want to go the other way, where it was either indecipherable. We didn't want people thinking they were reading Chaucer in the original language, or that it sounded so arch and formal
Stilted.
and stilted that it would.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was a tough balance to work
It is,
out.
but every historical novelist has to make those choices. I mean, Victorians can kind of get away, with not having to modernize anything, because mostly we can understand what they said, but you start going back further than that, and it's nearly, and everybody has to make choices. I've edited a lot of historical novels. I can remember the one that surprised me the most was the use of cement in a Byzantine novel.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought, that can't be right. I know that's, anachronistic. And so I looked it up and discovered that cement was a Roman invention.
Yeah.
And, so things that you think are anachronistic sometimes are not.
Yeah.
And then, you could make some statement like, he left the station or whatever, and you recognize that railroads didn't.
Right, exactly.
You really have to be so careful to do that. But you do want a voice that the modern reader can enjoy, and you don't want to slow the story down by having them have to get it translated or think about it.
Yeah, we wanted to make it accessible so that people who have read Clive's books can dive into this and not feel like they have to take lessons on the medieval era just to read it. We wanted it to be another fun adventure tale that just happens to take place in 1351 instead of 2021.
Right, and I think you succeeded. That makes it really fun. Anything else?
This is my own question. Have any fun brother-sister dynamics come out during the writing of this book?
He wants to know if they're still speaking to each other. Yeah, well, that's a really good question. Collaborating can produce its own strain. So how did you get past any?
I don't think we had any. I
No,
mean, we've been best friends all our
boring,
lives. And yeah, it's really boring. We didn't have any knockdown, drag-out fights. We both had strong opinions about storytelling, and especially Beth has strong opinions about the period details. And so we did have discussions when say my plot inclinations got in conflict with the period details, but I don't think. And we get this question a lot.
Yeah, I mean, we've always
from
been
everybody.
really good friends, and it's interesting. We get that question a lot, and I think that it must be pretty unusual because we don't know of any other brother-sister thriller teams who write together.
No.
So
there's teams.
There's brother Lee and Andrew Child, and there's sister with Lynn and Val Constantine, and but we don't know of any brother-sister ones.
Yeah, but I think in a way, it's worked out really well for us because, we've always been really good friends, but we really trust each other. And so it's actually been a great basis for a collaboration because we take each other seriously, we respect each other. Boyd has been so wonderful about being respectful of my time because I also have a full-time job while trying to do this. And so he's been really good. We talk a lot. We talk every day on the phone. We usually talk on the way to work and on the way back for work, one of the side benefits of working in Los Angeles. And we also have plotted large portions of this book while walking our dogs.
Yeah, it makes good sense. Well, cell phones, see, they really come in.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
we couldn't have done this book by letter.
No, and we couldn't have done it even, 15 years ago. The phone bills would have been more than we could have ever earned back on publishing the book. So it was really modern technology that made a medieval story possible.
Yeah, and we have a very similar sense of humor. So we wanted to put humor in the story too. And so, there are definitely times when the different characters banter back and forth, and that comes directly from us and we just had fun. Coming up with the story.
And we also, we break the tension with each other. We know how to do that. And so we'll be in a particularly, really knotty problem. And we'll be like, well, how does Gerard know that Lady Isabel is at Mont Saint-Michel?
Well, and Beth, he obviously Googles it. And
then she picks up the cell phone and calls him, and she gets on the helicopter.
Right.
And, and then we sort of laugh, and then it kind of resets us, and we can go back into a serious discussion. But we do that a lot.
Yeah.
Sounds wonderful. I'm glad you're having so much fun with it.
Oh, we are. It was such a fun project.
And I think the fun will carry over when you read it, too. Does anybody have a final question they'd like to ask before we wrap it up? No? Well, in that case, I want to thank you, our virtual audience, for watching tonight. And I thank you, our physical audience, for being here. And if you'll hang on till we turn off the camera, then you can come and get your book signed by both authors, which is extra fun, 2 signatures, right?
Well, and thanks to Barbara. This is really wonderful. It's my first real book signing, and it's just so exciting for me.
Oh, good. Well, I'm so glad that you've enjoyed it. And we're going to go out to dinner and geek out again on history in a little while. But anyway, really appreciate your coming. So,
Yes, thank you very much for being here.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.